Well, as you know, we will soon be hosting here at St. Patrick's the relics of St. Thomas Aquinas, come all the way from Europe, taking a tour of our Dominican province of St. Joseph. So the idea behind these couple of classes here is to get you ready for it. Get you ready for it to help you process this event. Tonight, we're going to do a little bit about his life, set within the context of the times in which he lived. There's a lot of material there. I hope I can cram it all in. Next week, Father Albert will be here to tell you something about some of his important works and why they're important, what they say to us even now, 800 years later. And then finally, after the relics have come and gone, I'll be back to say a little something about what happens to St. Thomas after his death. I'm going to bring you up to the point that he died, but then what happens after? The way in which his cult developed, his eventual canonization, and the whole history of, well, there's lots of ins and outs to that story. What happens to him afterwards? All the honors that will be heaped upon him. And a little something about how it was that he made this long trip to come and visit us. But tonight, we're going to look at his life. Well, first off, his dates. He's born, well, some debate about this already. He's born in maybe late 1224 or early 1225. Our sources give us little variations on that. You have to kind of work it out. But he dies most certainly in the year 1274, precisely on the date March 7th. That we know for sure. So look at that. When he died, he wasn't even quite 50 years old. And his life extends over the whole course of the whole middle section of the 13th century. The 13th century, which has been called by some writers in our Catholic tradition, the greatest of all centuries. There he is, right in the thick of it. What we want to do is set him into that context, go through his life, which is, well, he lives a life that's very representative of his time in many ways, but he's also showing us the way ahead, showing us why so many people have said that the 13th was the greatest of all centuries. Where do we get our information from? It's a little something about the sources. It's, of course, always difficult to patch together an account of the life of somebody who lived 8 centuries ago, you can imagine. We don't always have a lot to go by. Sometimes we've got almost nothing to go by. And this would apply to anybody, especially even when you've got some facts, especially when those facts are overlaid in the course of time with a lot of later legends as somebody's fame grows, his reputation, in this case for holiness, grows. All kinds of stories get attached to him. Nevertheless, the basics of his life are pretty clear. He's left us a decent paper trail. All right, I've given you his dates for birth and death as far as we can work out. Where do we get all this information from? A number of biographies that appear later on, after his death, of course, when the cult is beginning to grow, written by a number of people, none of whom really knew him, but they were able to talk to people who had heard something, from somebody when they were young. It's as close as we can get for a lot of things. Some of these biographers also just sort of crib things from one another. You take what you get. And none of them agree on everything, but they agree on most points. We've also got a set of official documents. Now the biographers are just sort of working on their own. We have official documents that were connected with his formal canonization process. Now here, just as today, the church would have gone out of its way to find people who could give them good information, Although, again, a lot of it is stuff passed down. When I remember talking to somebody years ago who told me this, right? But we've got, it was done about as well as they could have done it in those times to, verify the information that they were getting, to put together something that would show what kind of man he was. All right, so we have that. And we have, scattered other bits and pieces, since he ends up being a person of international reputation, somebody who played an important role in many of the events of his time. His name keeps popping up, and even scattered little bits of information can tell us something. They can either confirm or refute some of the things that other people tell us, and that's important as it is. It also helps us put together, like where he was on particular time, at a particular time in his life. There are things that we can pin down, but remember, there are always going to be gaps, there are always going to be question marks. All right, what are the things that basically everybody agrees about? Everybody pretty much agrees on the time of his birth, although they're not all very precise about it. 1224 or maybe early 1225. He's born in the family castle at a place called Roccasecca. Who's been to Italy? Anybody been to Italy? Okay, people have been to Italy. Okay, here you are in Rome. You arrive at the airport. If you're going to Naples, which way do you go? You go southeast, down the peninsula. Now it's a pretty easy ride. Back then, it was a bit longer. Roccasecca stands about halfway between Rome and Naples, along what had always been, one of the main routes south, the inland route between Rome and the south of Italy. His father was a member of the local gentry, the lesser nobility. His father was named Landolfo, to give it its Italian form. He was a descendant of a notable local family, which over the course of the last 200 years had pretty much dominated this little region. They were the most important family. They were descended from the Counts of Aquino. Sounds pretty important. He himself is not the Count of Aquino. He's from a junior branch. It's been diluted. But he's still a gentleman. That's the part that counts. His wife, Theodora, St. Thomas's mother, also comes from a noble family of pretty much similar status. And she would bear her husband a total of 9 children. 5 girls, 4 boys. Thomas will be the youngest of the boys. Besides that, there are all sorts of other connections. He's got at least 3 older half-brothers from his father's first marriage. It's a big family. But big families were important back then, especially if you came from the nobility. You needed a big family to sustain your position in society. You needed people to run your estates. You needed people to defend your estates from your neighbors who might try to take them over. This is the feudal era, of course. Law and order is sometimes a little hard to find. The girls, you married off to other families to firm up those family alliances on which, on this kind of network, this is how people survived. The noble families survived in those days. You forged alliances with other families. You use that to protect your interests. And some of St. Thomas's sisters will go on to marry into the nobility themselves, and we hear about some of them. The 4 boys, though, the boys are the most important. They're the people who can fight. this was also still important. The earlier Middle Ages had been a very violent time. Well, now things might be starting to settle down a little bit, but you still had to actively defend your rights. And you owed various services to the people who outranked you, to your feudal overlords. Now, in the case of St. Thomas's family, their feudal overlord is the King of Sicily. The Kingdom of Sicily in those days was not just the island of Sicily, it extended halfway up the peninsula, including Naples and the region around Roccasecca. We know that, let's see, I think one of his half-brothers, some years earlier, had served the king. Two of St. Thomas's own brothers will also be in royal service, serving, whenever called upon by the king to take the field so that he could defend his rights, whatever he thought they were. The king is a very interesting character and a very important character in his time. The king is, well, he's generally known to us as Frederick II, but he's really got a couple of kingdoms. He's King of Sicily. He's also the Holy Roman Emperor up in Germany. He is, at least on paper, the most powerful man in his age. And he's also a rather difficult character to get along with. Frederick is always at odds with somebody. Throughout his entire 30-year reign, he is almost always at odds with the popes. This is going to lead to complications for a noble family like St. Thomas's. Who do they owe their allegiance to? Well, they owe their allegiance to their Lord, but they owe their allegiance as well to their temporal lord. They owe allegiance to the Pope because he's head of the church, but they owe allegiance to the king too. What do they do if the Pope and the king get into a disagreement? We'll come back to this issue. Of his very early childhood, we don't know a whole lot. He'd have grown up at home. He had a nurse, we know, in his early childhood. The family was able to provide that kind of assistance to young Tommy. At the age of 5, he is sent to the great Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino, which is also right nearby. All these places are right nearby. Roccasecca, Aquinas, where the family had once had grand title, and Monte Cassino. This is the mother house of the Benedictine order. This is a place founded by St. Benedict himself. It's an enormous pile. If you've been there, you've seen it in that dramatic, on top of the mountain, this huge thing looming up there. He's sent as an oblate, as an offering to God. It's an act of piety, and this is a pious age. But it's also, given the family's situation, you can also think of it as kind of an investment. Here's another way in which you can shore up your family's position by exercising a little bit of patronage to the monks. By sending them one of your sons. This is typical of aristocratic families just about any age in Western European history. You sent your younger sons off to the church. What are they hoping for? They're hoping that if he grows up in the monastery, if he becomes a monk himself when he hits the age, that because of all of his local connections, he's a natural to one day be elected abbot. And it's something that they could easily have fixed because they were influential. They're looking ahead. Noble families back then were always looking ahead, always covering their bets. Here was a way to increase your family's status. Here was a way to help ensure the continuation of your family. Literally, because if you didn't provide for yourselves, it might all end in disaster for you. What did St. Thomas get out of this, the young St. Thomas? Well, he learns his lessons there. That's where he gets his basic education. But he's also introduced to all the rhythms of religious life. He learns to pray. He learns to study. He learns the routine, back and forth to the chapel, back and forth to the refectory, back and forth to whatever work you've been assigned to do. He grows up in a monastery, so it's kind of natural that he's going to absorb these lessons. Above all, perhaps he learns the virtue of silence. There's a whole little book, a little popular bio of St. Thomas by G.K. Chesterton called The Silence of St. Thomas. This is one of his salient characteristics all through his life. He was always a man of few words because he'd grown up surrounded by monastic silence, speaking only to God. He's going to be there for about 14 years. In 1239, however, there's trouble. I was telling you about the Emperor Frederick II before. Holy Roman Emperor, successor to Charlemagne, and all the rest of that stuff. But also King of Sicily and the immediate overlord of the Aquino family, let's call him that. In 1239, Frederick has gotten himself in trouble once again with the Pope. It's an on and off thing. It's on again, off again. They're on the outs. They're sometimes engaged in outright open warfare. And the Pope, using the only weapons that are readily available to him against such a formidable foe, from time to time launches an excommunication in Frederick's direction. In 1239, the Pope has excommunicated Frederick for the second time. They patched up the first one, but here, since they're always at each other's throats, he's excommunicated again. And once again, war breaks out between Frederick and the Pope. Frederick, in order to defend his interests, at this point occupies the monastery of Monte Cassino. It is a natural fortress. And this means the monks pretty much have to move out. There's a garrison place in the place. Young Thomas has to go with them. What do they do with him? There's a difference of opinion again among the scholars. Either they kind of send him back home and say, well, let's wait till all this blows over and, just for safety's sake, send him home. Or perhaps they sent him to another Benedictine house in Naples. But at any rate, he soon turns up there to finish his education, by whatever route he finishes up there. He's there to finish his education. He's there too to yes, I'd say yes. That's most of it at this point. Finish his education. Where does he study now? He's going to do his studies at the University of Naples. Now, I have something else to say about universities later too, but this is a big thing. This is an innovation from the tremendous growth of the university system in Europe. This is one of the hallmarks of this 13th greatest of centuries. And there's a university in Naples, a university founded by Frederick, mostly for his own purposes. He wants to have well-trained people working for him in his civil service and all the rest. It's for the training of people who are going to go on to serve him. This is where he's now enrolled. Studying, we're told, with a certain Master Martin. We don't know very much about Master Martin, even where he came from. But another man is named in Thomas's life at this point, and this is one Master Peter of Ireland. So there's a little St. Patrick's connection there, perhaps. The Irish had something to do with St. Thomas's early education. Okay, we'll give him that. It's here now, all right, having learned the lessons of religious life in all those years that he spent at the monastery, here he's going into a different kind of education, a more academic kind of education. Here in a very progressive, what we'd call secular, basically, largely secular university. This is not a place that has a reputation for its theological studies, its theological faculty. It's a place that has a reputation for the sciences. It's a place that has a reputation for philosophy, which was part of every potential civil servant's education. It's a place that will form you to serve your earthly master. It's here that St. Thomas is first introduced to the works of Aristotle. All right, now, you've heard that name probably. Maybe you even know something about him. Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher. He lived 300 years before Christ. His works during these days are just beginning to really make headway into Western Europe. In the early part of the Middle Ages, the Western world had to get along with whatever they had. They had mostly people like St. Augustine to study. They had the Latin church fathers to study whenever they could get their hands on these precious manuscripts. They knew about Aristotle, but they didn't know much. They knew only a very limited range of his literary output. But in other parts of the world, people knew a whole lot more. Here now in the 13th century, as Europe's horizons are expanding, and they're expanding in every direction. You know, they're expanding politically, they're expanding sociologically, they're expanding economically, they're expanding intellectually and spiritually. A lot of these other works of St. Thomas, of Aristotle, are beginning to find their way into the Western world. They're being translated into Latin, and they're getting around to all these new centers of learning. Where are they coming from? Much of this stuff, a great deal of, some of it's coming from the Greek East, but a lot more of it is coming from the Muslim East. The Arabs, having inherited Aristotle in a sense from the Greeks, the Arabs know a whole lot more about Aristotle than anybody in the West. They have access to a whole lot more of his works. They've studied them now over the course of a couple of centuries. Arab writers have written commentaries on Aristotle. This is the kind of material that is now coming into the Western world. And the directions that it's coming from directly from the East, some of it. This is the era of the crusading movement, you know. The 13th century crusades were still being There was still a Western presence in the Holy Land. Crusades were still launched from time to time. Individuals would go off on pilgrimage to the Holy Land because it was a little bit safer than it used to be. Some of it's coming direct from the East. Some of it is coming through Spain, which at this point in its history is still half occupied by Muslims from North Africa, who are also plugged into all these developments. And Aristotle's works and the works of the Arab commentators are being translated there into Latin and finding their way in from the western side. They're also coming up through Sicily. Here in Naples, you have the Kingdom of Naples is almost a, what do we say now, system that, a society that valued diversity. King Frederick has subjects who are not only Catholic Christian, he has subjects who are Greek, he has subjects who are Muslims. Here's another natural meeting point of this new learning to Europe, and Thomas is getting his first dose of it here at Naples. It's going to serve him in good stead over the whole rest of his career. He's exposed to it early, and a lot of it's going to stick. Naples is also going to turn out to be the place where he first encounters the Dominicans. In 1244, attracted somehow, we don't know how, we don't know what was going on in his head, attracted somehow to the Dominicans who have set up shop in Naples, this still new religious order founded only in the early years of the 13th century by St. Dominic. You probably know all that stuff. And he finds that the Dominican goal to create a new kind of religious life modeled on the life of the first apostles, a life dedicated to preaching, a life dedicated to a life that is lived out in apostolic poverty, the sharing of all goods in common, a life that is lived out for service to the church. One of the reasons why the Dominicans and the Franciscans too, who both represent this same impulse, won papal approval despite the doubts of many people, was because the Pope saw them as the spearhead for the, what we might call, the new evangelization, 13th century style. These people were meant to go out and proclaim the gospel. That's what they wanted to do. And something about all this appealed to Thomas. He got to a point where he was no longer content with whatever plans his family may have had for him. He discovered that he really wanted something more. And so, in 1244, he goes down to the Dominican house in Naples, San Domenico, still there, and presents himself asking to receive the habit, and they give it to him. Now, this is something that could bring a lot of trouble to the Dominicans for a whole bunch of reasons. In the eyes of many people, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, are still not quite respectable. They do make their way in the world by begging, literally. They are mendicants. They beg for their daily maintenance. They don't have ecclesiastical offices. They don't receive any kind of ecclesiastical revenues or rents from lands that belong to church lands or anything like that. They live literally by begging on the street corners. Still in this age, what's going to happen when Thomas's family finds out what's happened, that he's thrown over his education, that he's thrown over any idea of ever going back to Monte Cassino in the hope that one day he'd become an abbot, He doesn't want any of that anymore. He wants this. The Dominicans in Naples figure they better get him out of town fast, because it doesn't take long for his mother. His father has just died, I think, in that same year, 1244. So his mother is now responsible for holding everything together. His mother soon finds out what's happened and gets word to one of Thomas's brothers, Reynaldo, who is serving in the imperial army at war, on and off, with the popes. The Dominicans have sent Thomas to Rome, and he will soon move on in the company of the master of the Dominican order himself, who is on his way to the general chapter to be held in Bologna, north. All right, now they don't get very far. All right, there's all kinds of reasons for their trip being interrupted. The family is out to get the kid back and get him to do his duty to them. The emperor's forces, well, you know, here are some of those vagabond Dominicans who are now so favored by the Pope, our enemy. Maybe we can make some trouble for them. Not long after crossing out of papal territory and into Frederick's territory, this little caravan is waylaid on the road. Rinaldo is under orders to bring Thomas back home, whether he wants to go or not. Use force if necessary. Well, he doesn't. You don't have to ask him twice. He's a rough soldier. They kind of ambush the column on the road and grab Thomas, put him on a horse. Oh, first they try to tear his habit off of him, you know, just to make the point. Threatening violence to everybody there if they try and stop any of this. They load him on a horse and carry him off. He's abducted by his own family because, well, he has in a sense betrayed them, you know. But another thing about Thomas was always kind of stubborn. When he was convinced of something, he stuck with it. And he's convinced now that this is the life that God has called him to, and he doesn't want any part of anything else. Here also occurs, right after this violent little incident, here also occurs another famous scene. The scene in which Thomas's brothers try in their own way to discourage Thomas from continuing on the path he's chosen. Supposedly, according to the story that has come down to us in all the biographers, having grabbed him, they go to a safe place, another one of the family castles, not too far away, and introduce some woman into the cell in which they've got him locked up. The whole idea being to seduce him and to break his will. Well, you probably have heard this story. St. Thomas doesn't want any part of this either. He's not going to fall for this. He chases the woman right out the door, waving a flaming brand that he's pulled out of the fireplace. Inscribes a cross with that same charred branch on the wall and prays. Well, okay. His brothers have tried their tactics. They haven't worked either. But the next day they do set out for home and bring him back to Roccasecca, where his mother and other family members are going to try their best over the course of a year to get him to change his mind. He's not exactly in prison there, but he can't leave. They're keeping him until he sees reason. The The Dominicans in Naples, well, they soon find out where he is too, and they do their best to go out and try and, visit him at least, bring him a new habit, because his other one is torn to shreds. And after a year, the family gives up. Now, why do they give up? Well, I guess they see that Thomas isn't going to be moved, but also their situation has changed. The war hasn't gone very well for the Emperor Frederick. The Pope has raised the ante considerably, and in the year 1245, this very same year, an ecumenical council meeting up in France, they can't meet in Italy, it's too dangerous, meeting up in France, the Pope gives them the whole long history of all of the emperor's crimes and misdemeanors, and his excommunication is upheld, and he is now declared deposed from all of his kingdoms. Right, he's not going to take that lying down. The war is going to go on, but he has lost his status and is in great danger of losing everything. What you see here is the family once again taking care of its interests. They let Thomas go, in part, I'm sure, because the political situation has now changed dramatically, and they have to start reconfiguring their alliances. In any case, Thomas is done with that kind of life. What's his next stop? Oh, I might say too that all of these events might well have been something behind St. Thomas's lifelong refusal to accept any kind of ecclesiastical promotions. He's offered all kinds of things. At one point, they even had on the table, well, you can stay a Dominican, but we'll make you abbot of Monte Cassino too. This was actually a proposal at one point. He was offered all kinds of other honors and dignities and offices. He turned them all down. He didn't want any of it. Perhaps because he'd seen what all this chase after worldly success had done in his own family. When things really go bad for the Emperor Frederick, Big Brother Rinaldo is going to get involved in a plot against the emperor, which when it's discovered is going to result in his execution. See what I mean by it being dangerous to cross your feudal lord. Be that all as it may, where is Thomas going to go now? His first stop seems to be Paris, where he finally does a real novitiate instead of just being detained at home for a year. He finally does a real novitiate and continues his studies, which, remember, he has abandoned back in Naples. This would be 1245, once he gets out of Italy. In 1248, he will go to Cologne on the Rhine. It's now in Germany. He goes there in company with another Dominican notable, St. Albert the Great, who has been teaching in Paris and has perhaps already noticed this promising young student. Thomas and Albert will go together to Cologne, where Albert has been charged with setting up an official study house for the order. And Thomas will be, well, his assistant. Here too, he's going to be ordained around 1251. All right, that would make him about 26. That's pretty young to be ordained. Obviously, people have noticed his abilities. And then in 252, it's back to Paris on the recommendation of Albert and a few other people who have seen Thomas in action and know his qualities, to be enrolled in the great University of Paris and enter on an academic career. His duties here as a new bachelor, all these titles that we still use come down from the medieval universities, is to teach the basic undergrad course in theology, a course that is based upon a book, the standard textbook all over Europe by this time, the Sentences of Peter Lombard. This is a book that came from the end of the 12th century, and is now, carried the day. It's the standard book that everybody uses. You might think of him at this stage in his career as a graduate assistant, somebody who's teaching undergrad courses, getting some valuable teaching experience, hands-on, while at the same time under the supervision of a master of his own who was preparing him one day to move up to the level of being a master of theology. But he's arrived at a kind of delicate time. Arriving in Paris in 252, he comes in the middle of a big controversy. All right, now here we're going to say something about the university system. We've seen the university in Naples. We've gotten a little glimpse of this new learning that is flooding into Europe and needs to be processed. Increasingly, it's going to be processed at these grand academic institutions, places like Paris, like Bologna, like Oxford and Cambridge, and a few others who are, kind of the first generation of universities, a name which tells you right there that they want to pass on every kind of knowledge that there is. It's a universal approach to education. They will have faculties of the arts and sciences. They'll have faculties of philosophy, faculties of theology, faculties of law, both canon law and civil law. They'll have faculties of medicine. They want to do everything. It's a very heady time in European history when they thought they could learn all there was to learn. How did these big centers come about? They grew out of earlier cathedral schools, organized organized by the local bishop and supervised by him, where he would try to line up some well-known teacher to come and instruct his own local clergy, or people preparing to become part of his local clergy. In the big cities, like the ones I've just mentioned, these places start to attract more and more learned men and people who want to sit at the feet of learned men and become learned men themselves, they hope. What do? They too are often at odds with the bishop's authority because they want to explore new things. Bishops don't always like people doing that. What do? In typical 13th century fashion, they organize themselves into a kind of trade guild. That's what lots of other people are doing. It's another hallmark of the time. People want to have more say in how they live their own lives. people who all share the same line of work, highly skilled often, want to have some say about who's going to be allowed to become a member of this guild. What kind of standards are set for membership and all that. The scholars have organized themselves this way. It's a way of winning a little bit of autonomy from the bishop. We're going to start making some rules of our own here. In this moment, the Dominicans, who had not too many years before, back in the founding days of the Dominicans and the Franciscans, both, they go hand in hand in these days. They both represent the same sort of thing. They had been welcomed to Paris. But now, they're not so welcome anymore. The closed club resents these newcomers. They resent them and all their enthusiasm and the way in which they're stealing promising students from them, the way in which, just as St. Thomas himself had been stolen away, They are making a big fuss about admitting Dominicans and Franciscans to full membership in the club. And they're powerful. They can keep somebody out. They say, well, we only have so many chairs available. We have to restrict all these things. You have to meet all these qualifications and all that stuff. Where are you going to get that, if not from them? And they don't want to give. This is the kind of thing that provokes even riots in the streets. University students have often been known for this kind of thing, and universities have also often been known for these same kind of struggles. Academic freedom, that's what they're standing for in 13th century terms, against authority. They resent the new mendicants because of their ambitions, because of the ways in which the popes have loaded them down with all kinds of privileges, by the way in which they are stealing people away who would be paying customers to us if it weren't for them. Thomas arrives right in the middle of this, and he has to fight, like the devil, to get accepted. In the end, it's going to require papal intervention to get him to be admitted as a master in Paris. The Pope has to send a direct order to the Chancellor of the University, naming Thomas and his contemporary, St. Bonaventure, on the Franciscan side, and commanding them to be admitted to the university faculty. And even so, when St. Thomas goes to give his first, public inaugural lecture, the king, the King of France has to send some troops down to keep order. That's how volatile the situation is in Paris. But in 1256, Thomas is admitted to the grade of Master of Theology, and he can now take students of his own. What's his day like? His day is getting up early in the morning, saying his Mass, and getting to work. Regular lectures, public disputations, in which all kinds of people can like a doctoral defense. All kinds of people can raise, can attend and ask questions and raise objections and things like that. Thomas had to deal with this on a regular basis. There were regularly scheduled debates like this throughout the year, the academic year. He's also working on his own stuff, poring over not only the traditional sources that he's grown up with, the Bible, the fathers of the church, but poring over the works of Aristotle in any kind of new translation he can get his hands on. He's going to be doing this for 3 years, till 1259. Um, 1259, where am I? Here we are. Okay. Following his stint here as a full regent master, as they called it, which had a term. You were the primary professor, doing all these public things for a certain term. Having finished now his term in 1259, he's reassigned back to his own province in Naples. By this time, the Emperor Frederick has died, gone to his reward, whatever it may be. The struggle to actually seize the kingdom of Sicily and turn it over to new management is almost wrapped up at this point, so it's a lot safer to go back to Naples. He'll be there in the Dominican study house, teaching for the next 3 years. On his way back, on his way to Italy again, he makes one other stop, which I forgot to mention, a stop which says something about the order's high regard for this man and the way he has served the needs of our order already, his academic brilliance and all the rest, and his tenacity in the midst of all these trials of his. He is appointed to a special commission of the order to put together a regular academic plan for the formation of Dominican students, a universal plan, what we call today a ratio studiorum generalis, a standardized plan to ensure that Dominican students are properly prepared with their degree in arts before they send them to Paris, to make sure that none of this stuff happens in the future, that they will come prepared and so well prepared that Paris and other universities can't possibly turn them down. The way they had tried to do to him. All right. From that point, it's down to Naples for that next 3-year teaching stint. And after that, he's going to bounce around a little bit, from Naples to Orvieto, not too far from Rome, one of the primary, papal residences during these days. The popes moved around. They didn't always stay in Rome. Where he's in Orvieto during the time that the papal court is in residence, and he's assigned to the Dominican house, and perhaps from time to time gets a call from the Pope to work on some special project. It's during this time in Orvieto, for instance, between 1262 and 65, that St. Thomas reportedly was asked by the Pope personally to compose the liturgy for the newly instituted Feast of Corpus Christi. He's not a member of the papal household. You know, he's living in his Dominican house and teaching the students there, but he's on call. You know, it's handy having somebody like that right down the road from you. He can be called in for a special project. And this is something that lays the foundations for something that we still have in the order, the office of Master of the Sacred Palace, the Pope's personal theologian. Dominicans like to say that it began with St. Thomas, but you know, he's not quite that. You know, he's not of the papal household, but he's on call. You know, he's somebody that you can sign up for an important project. Dominicans have, of course, ever since then, you know, I don't know when the line becomes unbroken, but Dominicans have for a long time monopolized that office of Master of the Sacred Palace, the Pope's personal theologian. Did it start with Thomas? Well, yes and no. But Thomas sets a kind of precedent, maybe. 1265, he goes to Rome, where he has again been charged by the order to set up a study house at the principal Dominican church and convent in Rome, Santa Sabina. It's still the headquarters of the order. To set up a study house there. You see how these things mushroom. You know, this is why they want all those qualified teachers, so that they can go off and start new places. It's here in Rome that St. Thomas begins work on his most famous book, the Summa Theologiae, a book which he will call a book for beginners. And people have spent their whole lives studying this. To him, it was a book for beginners. This is just a start. He begins working on it here. In 1265. He does a couple of years in Viterbo, another town not too far from Rome. But then in 1269, he's going to go back to Paris for yet another round at the great university, the school that's acknowledged by everybody in Europe as the greatest theological school in the continent, in the whole Christian world. Once again, he's arrived at a difficult moment. There's another crisis at the university. This is a crisis that is provoked by a group of masters over in the arts faculty, professors of theology, who have also been busy studying Aristotle. But because they have been maybe a little too much influenced by some of the Muslim commentators on Aristotle, they've arrived at some conclusions that don't sit well with people. They have arrived, for instance, at what's called, well, people argue about whether they actually say this or not, but they've arrived at a kind of attitude that philosophy and theology, well, okay, there's truths in theology, revealed truths, but philosophy has its own rules. And by using our reason, you might well arrive at a conclusion that is at odds with the truths revealed by Christ and studied by the theologians. You might arrive at a conclusion that is even heretical, but it would still be true. How many kinds of truth are there? 2? It doesn't sound right, you know. Truth all comes from God. God is one. So truth ought to be one too. This is one of the things that St. Thomas has absorbed from Aristotle. But such is the reaction to these so-called Averroists, the name coming from the Latinized name of one of these Arab commentators. So strong is the reaction against these people on the part of old-fashioned religious traditionalists, people who still lean exclusively on Augustine and the Fathers, and don't really want to have too much to do with any of this stuff that comes from an old dead pagan, much less anything that's come through an infidel Muslim, that St. Thomas himself might well get tarred with the same brush. He has to steer a middle course between these radical Aristotelians on one hand and people on the other. And here he's going to end up parting company with at least on this issue, with the Franciscans, with Bonaventure. You know, he and Bonaventure stood shoulder to shoulder in the earlier controversy. On this one, they disagree. There are people on the other side who don't want to see Aristotle in the schools at all. They've always been suspicious of this new learning. We don't need it. We don't want it, especially if this is what it leads to. This is the situation in Paris when Thomas arrives. In 1270, the university will not the university, it's the Bishop of Paris, will feel the need to say something about this. He will condemn a set of propositions drawn, reportedly, from the opinions of these extreme Aristotelians, some of which Thomas might have even kind of agreed with. Kind of. Thomas is never mentioned by name in this condemnation in 1270, but it's clear that, you know, not everybody is as convinced that Aristotle has something to say as Thomas is. Thomas has to walk a narrow line here. The last thing he wants ever to do is to fall into a heresy. But he also doesn't want to give up on Aristotle, because he's known since his early school days that Aristotle does have a lot to say, that this non-Christian view of the world is something that we have to consider and take seriously. Well, this controversy is going to go on for a while too. Thomas will leave Paris again in 1272 after another 3-year hitch up there, and once again return to Naples, where he'll be from 1272 until his death in 1274. Now, something happens to him here. He's been working like crazy for years now, writing book after book after book, fulfilling all of his teaching responsibilities, holding these free-for-all academic disputations, preaching. Masters were responsible for university sermons as well. He's been doing all kinds of things in the service of the order, in the service of the church at large, and in the service of truth, which is always his guiding star. He is at this point visibly slowing down. He can't work quite with all the same enthusiasm that he once did. One day in 1274, oh no, it's 1273, sorry, 1273. It's December 6th, St. Nicholas Day. St. Thomas goes down to the chapel where he always says Mass, bright and early in the morning, together with his faithful secretary named Reginald, who is the ultimate source of a lot of the things the stories that we hear about St. Thomas, because he was with him all the time for years. To celebrate Mass, he celebrates as he always does with great devotion, but something happens to him in the course of saying that Mass. Something which leads him afterwards to say that he can't go on. He can't continue working. He leaves his Summa unfinished. He cannot bring himself after this experience, whatever it was, to put pen to paper ever again. I can't go on, he says to Reginald. And Reginald says, oh, come on, take it easy, take it a little slow, you'll be all right. You need to get back to work, And Thomas keeps saying, no, you don't understand. I can't go on because after what has been revealed to me, everything that I have done seems like just so much straw. Whatever it was that happened seems to have had both physical and spiritual effect on him. Physically, something's happened. From the descriptions that you get of St. Thomas before and St. Thomas afterwards, some people say, well, maybe he had like a stroke or something. Speech has become difficult for him. Walking has become a little difficult for him. He's always been quiet all his life, except when he was engaged in a debate, I guess. But now he's more quiet than ever. He's sort of turning in on himself. Some people think he had like a stroke, maybe. But there's also a spiritual dimension to this. What is it that has been revealed to him? Well, from the spiritual side, we say it's Christ himself who's revealed himself to him. The source, the goal of Thomas's whole life, truth itself in the person of Christ has revealed himself to him. And that makes everything he's done, no matter how great it may have been, no matter how much acclaim he may have won throughout the Christian world, seem like nothing. And after that, he never does write another word. All right, now this is December 1273. What was his death date? March the 7th. He's only got a few more months to live. When he dies, he is once again answering the call to serve the needs of the church. He has been summoned by the Pope to attend the ecumenical council that is meeting in Lyon, in France. A big question that's going to be discussed there is, yet another attempt to bring the Greek and the Latin churches back together. They've been in schism now for a couple of hundred years. But here, well, maybe there's an opportunity. St. Thomas has been summoned to attend. And he sets out, in all of his pain, with all of his anxieties, with all of his distractedness. He'd always been distracted too, all through his life. People even made fun of him for it. But now, more so than ever, as if nothing that's going on around him matters much. But he goes. And it's on the course of that journey that he has another accident. They're traveling down a road. Thomas is riding on a donkey. It's the best any Dominican could do. We weren't supposed to ride horses or anything like that, or travel in any luxurious fashion. If you weren't walking, riding a donkey, well, we might say that might be okay. But he hits his head on a low-hanging branch over the road, and it knocks him down to the ground. Now, if he has had a stroke or something like that, this is the last thing he needs. because this could lead to brain hemorrhage. And from this moment on, you can see that he's failing. He goes, they take him to visit his sister who lives along the way. His sister is married. His sister is a countess. She's married to a count. He stays with her for like a day or two. And his sister doesn't know what's come over him. You know, she too sees something's wrong. They continue on, passing the Cistercian Abbey of Fossanova. And all these places are, you know, it's St. Thomas's old neighborhood almost. He stops there. They receive him into their guest house because he's really now in pretty bad shape. And it's there that he's going to die on March 7th. Some of the sources rather piously tell us that as a little thank you to the monks who have been so kind to him during the time, that he dictates one last little commentary, a commentary on the Song of Songs. We don't know if that actually happened or not. There is no text of such a thing that's come down to us. It may be just a pious legend. But it says something again, doesn't it? It says something about the kind of man he was. Always ready to answer the call to duty, always ready to raise things to a spiritual plane and see that truly life in this world doesn't amount to much more than a pile of straw compared to what awaits those who are ready to serve the Lord with all the gifts that he has given them. All right, now I think at that point I better stop, because they told me under no circumstances am I supposed to go past 8:30. So this gives time for any questions that you might have about anything. Yes?
I might have missed it when I stepped out, but where did he give the moniker dumb lots?
Well, that seems to go back to his days in Cologne, when, right, physically he was a big man. You know, he seems always to be portrayed as enormously fat, but I don't think he was enormously fat. In fact, I can almost guarantee that he wasn't enormously fat. I think it's in Orvieto, in the church in Orvieto, there's a pulpit that goes back to Thomas's day, and we know that he preached from that very pulpit. And if he was enormously fat, he wouldn't have been able to fit into it. You know, it's the size of a phone booth. You know. But he was big. He was physically big. There are physical descriptions of him too in some of the biographical material. And because he was always so quiet, people thought he was stupid. So here he is in school in Cologne, and you know, some of the other students there, you know, either make fun of him for being a bit dumb, in both senses of the word. Other students kind of feel sorry for him. They think he can't keep up with his lessons. There's a story about one student who, you know, sees that, you know, St. Thomas just sort of sits there listening to the lecture, and you don't get any reaction or anything like that. You know, and he thinks he doesn't understand what's going on. So he takes him aside. He says, let's go over that lecture together. You know, he's trying to help him. He means well, but as he starts explaining it to Thomas, Thomas in his humility says, well, yes, thank you for sitting down with me and going over this. But as he's explaining it to Thomas, he gets it all wrong. And Thomas ends up saying, well, no, I don't mean to interrupt you or anything, but you know, what he really said was this, and this, and this, and this, and this. And he leaves the other guy looking dumbstruck. But that seems to be the place where he got the nickname. And another story from that time, linking him to Albert, says we call him the dumb ox, but one day his bellowings will fill the whole world, a little prediction of future greatness. Albert recognized what he really was. So there's the story as far as I know it. Yeah.
So why was Aristotle such all the rage?
Well, why was he all the rage? Because this is new. This is exciting. This is a whole new way of looking at the world and everything in it. They're looking now at Aristotle's metaphysical works. They knew nothing about those things. They'd known about them in the East for centuries already. And they'd been studying them all that time. Compare again to our own times. What's all the rage right now in the intellectual world? I heard it. Artificial intelligence. Isn't everybody just talking about artificial intelligence till it makes you sick? The same level of excitement could be seen back there in the 13th century about these unknown works of Aristotle.
What was his relationship, interaction with Albert?
Well, he's Albert's prize pupil.
Where?
Well, possibly in Paris, because they're both there at that time. It may be that they were both busy with different things, but possibly at Paris. But certainly when Albert then goes to Cologne in 1248 to start up the new study house, not 1240, I got the date wrong, whatever it goes. Got a date there somewhere. When he goes to Cologne. Yeah, 1248. Okay. When Albert is sent to Cologne to start the new study house for the German province, Thomas is sent along with him. So perhaps he's already attracted Albert's eye. Here's a good guy to send to be my assistant in this project. And certainly when then Thomas goes on to Paris, he goes with a glowing recommendation from Albert.
Albert stays in Cologne, and did they ever reconnect?
Not in this life. After Thomas's death, when there's still controversy over Aristotle, well, we'll talk about this 2 weeks from now. Albert who's now, like about 90 years old, Albert will make the trip to Paris to defend him.
When did Albert die?
Albert dies, I think, in 1280.
Okay. Was it in Orvieto where St. Thomas wrote the
Yep. Well, I mean, there are a lot of difficulties about the text because what we have now is not all the same as what he wrote, if he wrote anything at all. There's all kinds of twists and turns to the whole story of Corpus Christi and the bull which made it which raised it to a feast. The first time a pope had ever just invented a new feast day. There's a lot that's not known about, a lot of loose ends. But Thomas, the tradition emerges in the 14th century that Thomas had something to do with it. And it might well be so, but it's complicated.
So the words have the certainty ascribed to him, and certainly the actual musical setting would even be more mysterious.
The music, I don't know where the music would have come from. The texts themselves may have been written by Thomas. His part in it may, though, have been gathering together existent texts and putting them into an order. Because the funny thing about the feast day, once it's solemnly proclaimed, it seems to be ignored for about 30 or 40 years. The Pope, who was such an enthusiast for it, died not long after the event, and then his successors never seem to have taken it up again for years. You know, it takes a while for that feast to really get momentum, but Thomas and the Pope, Urban IV, they did have a personal relationship. They knew one another. Urban may well have, you know, farmed out this project to Thomas, since they were both there. It's possible, but there's a lot we don't know.
How do you think that his life at Monte Cassino prepared him to become a Dominican? Because if you look at the studies of the Benedictines, the Dominicans seem to incorporate a lot of their...
Well, okay, you know, they're two very different kinds of life, right? The Benedictine style is classically monastic, and the friars in this whole apostolic movement at the end of the 12th, early 13th. You know, this is St. Dominic too, and St. Francis. But there were other people even before that who were onto a similar idea. This is something that we now think of as being quite different. But a lot of the life was not so different. People did still call Dominicans and Franciscans monks in those days. They didn't make a big fuss about any distinction. They realized that it was a different kind of life. They realized that monks live off the monastery lands. They live off their own manual labor, or the labor of their tenant farmers. Dominicans don't have any sources of income like that. It's only free will offerings, no property, except their own houses, you know, held in common. That's it. We recognize now that it's a quite different kind of life. They, at the time, would have had a hard time imagining it being a totally different sort of life, but they noticed that there were important differences, right? And that's what made the mendicants a little suspect in people's eyes. You know, what kind of monks are these? Are these the very kind of people that all the classic monastic writers always warned us about? People wandering around, doing whatever they like, not living together under a rule where people can keep an eye on what they're up to, in the proper form that a monk ought to live by. Add to that a certain amount of jealousy at the rapid success of these orders, and you see, you know, people like the secular masters in Paris getting very nervous, because this is infringing on what they see as their prerogatives.
I think more of what I was trying to get at is, do you think the life of when he was with the Benedictines in the monastery, that contemplative meditation and intellectual study is what eventually brought him to the Dominicans?
Well, I think it certainly gave him habits. It gave him a lifelong habit of study, but it's a contemplative kind of study, something suited to monastery life. But Dominicans lived that kind of life too in their houses. It gave him a habit of prayer, and it's a liturgical prayer tradition. Dominicans still had that. contemplation is one of our ideals, you know. We're supposed to contemplate just as much as any Benedictine in his monastery does. We're supposed to do that. But then we're supposed to hand it on to other people. We're not just keeping it for ourselves up there in the monastery. We're supposed to be down here spreading it around. So I think he got a foundation in all that. He got a foundation in a solid prayer life, a solid life of study, a life of traditional monastic regularity, even though in this other form of life that he's eventually going to come into, there are adjustments that have to be made in that if you're going to do what it is that your founders wanted you to do, right? And that the church wanted you to do.
I thought that you gave a great, overview of his life. Thank you. Does a title come to mind that you might recommend?
A book?
Yeah, a book.
Just so happens I'm wrong.
If you wanted to, aside from like the film,
Okay, well, there are a number of
kind of like a biography.
yeah, there are a number of kind of popular versions of a biography of Thomas. The one that comes to mind is G.K. Chesterton. It's just a little book, called The Dumb Ox, and it's a companion piece to another similar book that he wrote about St. Francis. So looking at the two of those together would give you a good idea of what's going on in this time, because they are Dominic and Francis are almost exact contemporaries. Thomas and Bonaventure are almost exact contemporaries. Reading the two of those together give you a good sense of the flavor of religious life in those days and life in the church in those days. If you're looking for something beyond that, if you're looking for lots of names and dates and different theories compared and all that, the full scholarly treatment, there are a couple of those around. This is a book called Friar Thomas d'Aquino, his Life, Thought, and Works, written by James A. Weisheipel, OP, of the Central Province. He's died a few years back. This came out in the 70s, I think. There are a couple of newer ones. First copyright here is 74. But this is good. It's very thorough, it's very scholarly. There are parts, especially when he's talking about his literary output, where my eyelids begin to droop, because that's not my kind of thing, abstract philosophical questions are not my kind of thing. But it's certainly a very solid scholarly assessment and fairly recent. Yep. And there are others there are one or two anyway that are more recent than this, which try to treat, his life as well as, just simply focusing on his works. There's tons of that stuff around. Okay? So thank you all very much. It's 8:29. Couldn't have planned it better, huh? So thanks for coming. Next week, we got a second installment from Father Albert, and then the week after that will be me again as the cleanup. He's going to talk about some of his important works. All right, and I'm going to do the canonization and all the rest, the cult of Thomas. Okay. Oh, I should drop these off in the office so they can give them out?
When it's time
Okay,
for that.
okay, yeah. I'll see that they get delivered.
So you